Good morning. It is good to see everybody here this morning. Good to have you with us. Good to see our members here. Good to see some visitors with us. We're happy to have you with us here at Myrtle Beach. And we always want to welcome those who are with us this morning online. It's good to have you with us this morning also. We're going to be continuing our study this morning in Mark chapter 6. And hopefully we'll get through the end of the chapter. Perhaps not, but we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6 this morning. And before we get into the text, if you'll bow with me, I'll offer a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you have given us, for our ability to and desire to be here this morning. We thank you so much for providing this opportunity that we can open a portion of your word. We are especially thankful, dear Lord, for visitors who come our way, as they are a great encouragement to us. We thank you for bringing some of our members back who have been away from us because of illness, and we're so thankful that you have returned their health to them. We ask you, dear Lord, to be with us as we gather here this morning and open your word, that you will strengthen us through that word. Help us, dear Lord, to take the message with us each day as we are away from the brotherhood here and living in the world around us. Ask all of these things through your Son, Jesus' holy name. Amen. We're going to pick up this morning in Mark chapter 6, and we'll just have a couple comments on closing out the section. Let me see if I can... Michael, I can't advance my slides. Okay. We're going to finish out with a couple comments on the section we just left, where Mark had recorded for us the event surrounding the beheading of John the Baptist. And as we talked about the story, we're familiar with that story, but a couple things I wanted to bring to our attention just so we can add a little bit more clarity to it. If you'll turn with me to Matthew chapter 14, and we're going to be looking at verse 12. Matthew 14 and looking at verse 12. And here, Matthew records for us something that we didn't get from our account in the Gospel of Mark. And as Matthew had kind of given us a briefer account of what happened to John the Baptist, he closes it out in verse 12 and says, "Then his disciples," and this means John the Baptist's disciples, not Jesus' disciples, "then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus." So what had happened was the disciples of John the Baptist, after they had buried John the Baptist, they were the ones who went and told Jesus the story, the events that happened around John's death. We remember the account that was given for us. It was a feast that Herod had given for all of the rulers, military and civil rulers, and during that feast, Herodias' daughter, Salome, had pleased those who were gathered there to where Herod had promised her as a reward, she could have anything up to half of his kingdom. And then Herodias' daughter left the assembly of the feast, went back to her mother and said, "What should I ask for?" And Herodias said, "Have Herod the king give you the head of John the Baptist." And in that gathering, it was obvious that there weren't any other Christians, unless they may have been servers or something. They wouldn't have been part of that kind of king's court, if we can use that term, where it would have been the military and civil leaders that would have been there and seen all of this. Also, let's take a look at Luke, and we're going to look at Luke chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. Just to get a little more information regarding the events around John the Baptist killing by Herod. Luke 9, beginning in verse 7. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and here the him is Jesus, and he was perplexed because it was said by some that John had risen from the dead, and by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the old prophets had risen again. Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? So he, Herod, sought to see Jesus. Now we remember that often Herod was one who was looking for new information. He was the ruler in that area under Caesar, and it was his job to make sure that everything in the land was quiet. Everything went smooth. He was to keep the peace. So that was part of why Herod had imprisoned John the Baptist. And now Herod hears that there is this one who is coming up and causing a stir in that area. And he says, well, it can't be John the Baptist because I beheaded him. It is not that I believe any of these other prophets had been risen again. So let me find out who this Jesus is. And he had sought to see Jesus. So I just wanted to close that out so we could get a sense of a couple items there that we didn't look at last week. And as we enter the next section, which begins in Mark chapter 6 in verse 30, here it says, Then the apostles gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And this was after Jesus had sent out the apostles 2 by 2 so that they could do some personal work. They were going to go out and preach and teach and heal. and perform miracles as kind of preparing them for the time when Jesus wasn't going to be there to lead them. And in verse 31, and he said to them, "Come aside by yourselves to this deserted place and rest a while." For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. What does that remind us of that we had looked at just a couple weeks ago? When Jesus himself didn't have time to even take a meal because they were pressing on him so strongly. Let's take a look at back at Mark chapter 3 in verse 20. Mark chapter 3 and verse 20. And here Mark records for us, "And then the multitude came together again, so that they could not so much as eat bread. But when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said he was out of his mind." And his people, his family, the disciples that were there, as they went out to take hold of him, they didn't truly believe he was out of mind, but it was he worked so much that he just can't get anything, doesn't have time to take a meal, doesn't have a time to do those things he needs to do. So here we now see that Jesus is concerned about the apostles, and they go away to a deserted place to rest a while. Take it easy. They've been out on the road, we might say. They were walking from city to city and teaching. And Jesus, when he was teaching, he would be in a house, and there wouldn't be room for anybody else to even get in the door of the house. They would be so crowded. And here, Jesus understands that these apostles had worked very hard and needed to rest and relax, take time to eat. And so he said, "Let's get away from the crowd." Now, we had talked about the account of John the Baptist being beheaded was kind of an interlude from back in early in chapter 6, where Jesus had sent the apostles out, and they were, even at that time, always surrounded by a throng. They didn't have to look for people to teach. The people, when they heard that Jesus was there, they crowded around. Why was that? I mean, they wanted something. Even Jesus had said the once, "You come to me for the healing, for the miracles." They saw something that no one had seen before. Now, certainly, we understand the purpose of Jesus' miracles. What was the purpose of miracles? I'm sorry? Confirm the word that Jesus was teaching. Now, we know that Jesus, here on earth, they accepted what he was teaching as his word, but he always said, "I am a messenger from God. I am bringing his message." It wasn't his own. And to affirm the message, God had given them the miracles. Just as we remember, looking forward a bit, when the apostles received the gift of the Holy Spirit in Acts, that they received the ability to do miracles again to affirm their message when they were going out and teaching. But Jesus had taken them away so that they would be able to get a little rest, to have a quiet meal. But the people around him, those who wanted to hear his teaching, they really were going to do everything they could to see Jesus. As we pick up in verse 32, so they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. So as Jesus is continuing to work his way around and back and forth all over the Sea of Galilee, first going to one side, then going to the other, or going down the coast, so that they could travel more easily than taking the road most of the time. It says here that they departed in a boat by themselves, but in verse 33, it says, but the multitudes saw them departing. They were there. The multitude saw them departing, and many knew Jesus, knew him, and ran there on foot from all the cities. Jesus said, let's get away to a deserted place. But they were sailing along the shore. They were just going where they could still be seen. And the people are saying, look, there he goes. And they were running along the coast from city to city. And the people there, where are you going? Well, we're following Jesus. And they gathered up people as they went along. They were not going to miss out on hearing Jesus speak. Verse 33, and the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him, to Jesus. Well, of course, Jesus is in the boat with the apostles. They're going to come ashore someplace. So when they got to the shore, the people were there waiting for him. He didn't get that quiet time that he had hoped for. Verse 34, and Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And as Jesus had came out of the boat and stepped on the land, and there's this multitude around him. Boy, you know, if you can't get away taking a boat across the lake, you know, you're not going to run away from all those people who had gathered up. They were there, and they were waiting to hear what Jesus had to say. So when verse 34, so when Jesus came out and saw a great multitude, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And in verse 35, when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Jesus got to a deserted place, what should have been a place where there weren't a lot of people around, where there would not normally be there. It could have been, even a desert area. There wasn't anything relatively close. They weren't in the city. They weren't in a little village. And the apostles came to Jesus and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late." Verse 36, "Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." There is this multitude, and we're going to find out pretty quickly that there were 5,000 men plus women and children there. It seems like it could have well been the majority of the population in that area. 5,000 men alone, plus the women and children, and they don't have bread, and they have not brought anything to eat. Well, sometimes during the pandemic and since then, we go into a grocery store and it doesn't have the food that we would expect it to have, and the shelves are empty. Or they don't have the brand that we like, and we've got to get something else. And here was 5,000 people. It would have taken a sizable town to have places where they could even buy food for 5,000 people. That's a lot of people. The apostles certainly were concerned about the people who had followed Jesus. They may have been concerned for themselves. How did their day start out? What did it tell us in verse 30? The apostles gathered to Jesus, told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And Jesus said to them, "Come aside by yourself to a deserted place and find rest," because they hadn't even had time to eat. They were already hungry. They were already tired and worn out. And they had sailed the boat around the lake to get away from the people. And now they get out. And Jesus sees this great throng of people, and he teaches them all day. All of a sudden, it's becoming dinner time. Remember, they haven't had a chance to stop and eat. No chance to rest. And they're saying to Jesus, let us go into town so we can buy some food, buy some bread so that we can eat. Jesus answered them, tells us in verse 37, and said to them, "You give them something to eat." You give them something to eat. And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat? Shall we take the amount of 200 days' wages and buy them something to eat?" And even that may not be enough. Let's take a look at John chapter 6, verse 6. John John chapter 6, verse 6. Well, let's back up to verse 5. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test them, for he knew himself what he would do. Jesus knew what the options were. He knew what he was going to do. He was going to feed all these people, but he does this to get the apostles to stop and to think. To stop and to think. We talked about in weeks past, maybe even months, about Jesus' miracles. And, he started out with his miracles healing people who were sick. And then he went on to raising the dead. And then when the first time he was in the boat where a storm had came up and they were concerned about their life for fear the boat would capsize, they went to Jesus, who was sleeping in the back of the boat, and Jesus spoke the storm quiet. He was bringing them to an understanding of who he was and what power he had. He had the power to heal the sick. He had the power to raise the dead. He had the power to control the weather, that natural world around us. And now the next step. He had the power to be able to feed these people. In verse 38. Here we see in Mark 38. How many loaves do you have? Go and see. How many loaves? What do you have with you? What do we have here with us that we can feed these people? Manny? Yeah, absolutely. Satan holds them back from their belief, doesn't he? Keeps them from forward thinking, we would say. He has to refresh and reinforce that it can be done. But he sends them and says, here you've got this multitude. Surely somebody must have something. Go and see how much food we've got that we can share and feed this 5,000 men plus women and children. And it says in the second portion of verse 38, and when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. So how much bread do we have? We've got 5 loaves and 2 fish that we have. Well, 5 loaves and 2 fish were somebody's lunch that they just happened to bring with them. But in 39, Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. Now, some of the other accounts say sit down in groups of 100 or sit down in groups of 50. Basically, everybody just sit in a group and we will get to you. In fact, it's here in verse 40. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and in fifties. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. We've got 12 apostles. And Jesus gives thanks for what they have. And he starts breaking the bread and dividing the fish. And as like we have our men serve the communion here, they were waiting there for the portion that they could serve to these people in groups of 100 or 50. Can you imagine their eyes and their hearts? That as Jesus kept breaking the bread, it never ran out. And he broke it and said, okay, this is for that group and this for that group. And take this here. And they just kept carrying it out. And some people maybe just ate a little, wanting to make sure there was enough for all. Some people were really hungry and they ate more. And as our potlucks always experience, somebody came back for seconds. They kept coming. And here they were. And he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and had given thanks for it. So they all ate and were filled. Now, you know, if it would have stopped there, we'd be here talking about, well, I'm sure that a lot of people didn't eat. And they just ate what they had and they were satisfied with that. But, verse 43.
Russ,
yes, Babs.
on this one, it doesn't say anything about the little boy with the lunch. And in John 6, where's it? A child, there was a lad there that had 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. But in this account, it doesn't say a lad.
Actually, Matthew, Mark, and John, they all have a little different, they give us a little more information. Like you say in John 6.
It was 6:9.
Okay, yep, 6:9. There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they amongst with so many? If we go to Matthew chapter 14, and we begin in 16. But Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they said, we have here 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And Jesus said, bring them to me. And in Luke, beginning Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 12. When the day began to wear away, the 12 came and said to him, "Send the multitude away that they may go into the surrounding towns." In verse 11, Jesus again here is recorded as saying, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fishes, unless we go and buy food for all these people." So each one of the accounts have something a little different. They give us a little more nuance of what is happening. And Mark actually gives us, in some areas, the most complete description of what was happening there, especially the death of John the Baptist and this miracle of feeding the 5,000. But other times, Mark doesn't even address some of the other miracles and events in Jesus. So as you are doing your study, it's always helpful to take a look at parallel passages because they add a lot to it. And well, actually, we want to get back to Mark. Mark 6:42. So they all ate and were filled. And then in verse 43, and they took up 12 basketfuls of fragments and of the fish. They had 12 baskets full. Not a little bit laying in the bottom. Then, certainly to the apostles, they were made aware that this was extraordinary. This is Jesus performing another miracle now for these people who were gathered here. And verse 44 records for us, now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. And one of the other translations say, not counting the women and children that were there. So it wasn't just 5,000 men. Jesus performed a miracle that had been beyond that. At the end of that day, when the feeding of the 5,000 was done, we see in chapter 6, verse 45, it says, immediately he, Jesus, made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. So Jesus dispersed the crowd, and he sent his apostles on before him, certainly to give them some rest, give them some time to recover, probably some time to reflect on the miracle that Jesus had performed that day. And in verse 46, and when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Jesus now also took that time to get away from the apostles, get away from the crowds, and go to a quiet place that he could pray. Remembering now he had just been informed recently about John the Baptist, his friend, his family member, the one who had baptized him, the one who was preparing the way for him, who had been killed by Herod. Verse 47, now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. So now the apostles were to go away. Jesus departed and prayed, and Jesus saw the boat in the middle of the lake. And then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, the middle of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. It was like he was going to go right past them and go on to the shore in front of them. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. Now, it's not like they called out and say, hey, Jesus. They cried out because they were afraid, because they saw an image walking across the water during the middle of a storm that they couldn't even row against the waves and make headway. They cried out in fear. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. That wind was there just to slow them down. So when Jesus was done with his prayers, he could walk up there and they could see him again perform a miracle that no one had ever seen before.
This was a miracle for the apostles because it was at night, nobody else knew. It's kind of interesting that it happened at night, there wasn't a big crowd there watching.
Yep.
They would have gone, so it was really for the apostles.
Right. Yeah, solely for them that were in the boat. And just kind of a side note from that, sometimes the apostles, whether they were being courteous or whether they didn't want to declare to everyone that they didn't know the power that Jesus had when he performed a miracle or he told a parable, they waited till they were alone to ask the questions. What did that really mean? And sometimes he chides them. And how come you still don't understand? Why are you still so slow to learn? But when Jesus, in verse 51, went up into the boat and the wind was ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure and marveled, for they had not understood about the loaves because their heart was hardened. They didn't understand because they still hadn't opened their hearts enough to understand what Jesus was doing.
In Matthew's account, verse 33, chapter 14, and they that were in the boat worshiped him, saying, of the truth, thou art the Son of God. Which has been confirmed there.
And, sometimes they seem to have an epiphany that all of a sudden this teacher that they were following was the Son of God, but then a little bit later, when something even more miraculous comes, their faith is tested again. Already, Jerry is ready to turn folks into the auditorium. I appreciate your attention and your comments, and we'll pick it up here next week. Thank you.